In April 1945, the British Army entered Belsen camp. This is what they saw.
Today is the 24th of April, 1945. My name is Gunnar Illingworth and I live at Cheshire. I'm at present in Belsen camp doing guard duty over the SS men. The things in this camp are beyond describing. When you actually see them for yourselves, you know what you're fighting for here. Pictures in the paper cannot describe it at all. The things they have committed, well, nobody would think they were human at all. We actually know now what has been going on in these camps. I know personally what I am fighting for.
An early witness of these scenes was Sidney Bernstein, head of film section of the Allied Psychological Warfare Division.
It was pretty awful, horrifying sights. People looked more like animals than human beings, dead bodies all over the place, and smell, stench went for miles. As you get nearer the camp, you could smell it.
Sidney Bernstein was determined that the German people should see the full extent of what he had seen. Simple newsreels would not be enough. He wanted to assemble overwhelming evidence of the existence of Nazi concentration camps, permanently recorded on film, so that these atrocities could never be denied. The war was still going on, yet he persuaded the Russians and Americans to send film of other camps to add to this British film of Belsen. When this material reached London, it was so shocking, and the message it contained so urgent, that Sidney Bernstein was able to assemble a distinguished team of journalists and advisors to help him.
My instructions were to film everything which would prove one day that this had actually happened. It'd be a lesson to all mankind as well as to the Germans, for whom the film that we were putting together was designed to show to the German people. Because most of them, on our way down and on the troops' way down, had denied they knew anything about the camps. This would be the evidence which we could show them.
But Bernstein's film was never shown. The British government first encouraged it, then discouraged it. It's lain in the archives for 40 years. This is the story of that film and why it was never shown, but it's also the story of the camps. We hear what happened before the cameras got there, from those who survived. The film was started while Europe was still at war. Its producers were anxious to show that the German people were responsible for the growth of the Nazi monster. It opened with scenes of Hitler at the peak of his popularity. The original film's commentary was never recorded, but a script has survived. It's written in the mood of the time and is narrated in the style of the time.
In March 1933, 17,264,296 Germans voted for the National Socialist Party. 20,680,000 cast their votes for Democrats, Communists, Christian Socialists, People's Party, and so on. Lack of unity among these parties opposing the Nazis proved fatal. The National Socialist Party was in power. They made many claims and many promises. The German people had embarked on that long, incredible journey that led seemingly out of chaos to unprecedented triumph. In the spring of 1945, the Allies, advancing into the heart of Germany, came to Bergen-Belsen. Neat and tidy orchards, well-stocked farms lined the wayside, and the British soldier did not fail to admire the place and its inhabitants. At least until he began to feel a smell. It came from a concentration camp, a waste ringed with barbed wire and overlooked by watchtowers. Coming in from the flowering countryside, in spite of the frightful smell, things didn't seem so bad at first. Children smiled through the barbed wire, and women laughed and waved their hands. But Belsen camp was vast, and inside was a different story. They had not eaten for 6 days, and every soldier's stock of food was called into use. Water, too, had been cut off, so the water cart was the most important thing to arrive. Most of the people seemed to be listless, beyond hope and astonishment. Hunger had probably affected them that way. We discovered that among the stench of disease and decay was something a bit worse than hunger. Moving vaguely on rickety skeleton legs, they were too ill to eat. How grateful they were for a kindly word or gesture. What misery to live among such unmentionable filth, with scarcely the strength to pick the lice which inevitably swarmed all over them.
There was a girl standing some way back behind the gates, and she had a plea in her eye, and I didn't answer it. I didn't know what to do. She wasn't a beauty or anything like that. She was a good-looking, sensible girl there, an inmate. She couldn't have been in long, otherwise she wouldn't have been in her overcoat and what she had on. And that keeps on coming back as a memory, that girl standing there on her own. And I think I should have done something about it at the time.
Witnessing the liberation was 18-year-old Anita Lasker, a survivor of 3.5 years in different camps.
I remember somebody said, I think the British are coming. I didn't want to know. However, in the end, I believe my sister dragged me out of the bunk and we sat down on the ground, leaning against the barrack. By that time, it was summer. Well, it was spring, and it was very warm. And it didn't help the bodies, of course. It was the most unbelievable stench. So we are told by the people who came in, we no longer smelled it. So we sat outside there and just waited for something to happen. And there it was, a loud hailer. You're liberated.
One of the first British soldiers to see all this was cameraman Bill Lorry.
They looked at you and didn't register anything. They didn't smile, they didn't cry, they didn't laugh, they did nothing. The expressions didn't change. Their eyes were glazed. And as I say, whether they actually saw you or not, I don't know. But there was no feeling of jubilation. We're free. I don't think they contemplated that ever.
This man had died by violence. Huts were almost impossible to go near. They were full of tangled masses of people who had died slowly and painfully of starvation and disease, writhing in agony, helpless in puddles of excrement.
What were conditions in these huts like by this time?
Unbelievable, especially as people died and died and died, and you had to take the bodies out and more bodies, and they piled up, as you've seen in the pictures, and there was no way to remove them even. There wasn't nothing. It was inferno.
Dead prisoners hurled out and stacked in twisted heaps. Dead women like marble statues in the mire. This was what these inmates had to live among and die among. The dead which lay there were numbered not in hundreds, but in thousands. Not 1 or 2 thousands, but 30,000. Here is a pit where the inmates, in order to earn food, had to drag the bodies of their comrades. But they were too weak to keep up with the rate at which they were dying, so the pit remains only half filled. The SS guards in charge of the camp were captured and lined up for examination. Their papers were gone through to confirm their status, their authority. Each with his death's head badge, each justified by German law. They were unashamed, well-fed, well-dressed, and cheerful. There were women also on guard in Belsen. volunteers who came of their own free will to do their bit. Not sickly pale with hollow faces and hungry eyes, but well fed and well kept with a strutting arrogance. The commandant of the camp, Joseph Kramer, was removed for trial as a war criminal by an Allied military court. There was an urgent need to get rid of as many bodies as possible, as quickly as possible, so all the SS were set to work. 500 Hungarian troops captured with the SS were started on a grave-digging operation. The SS themselves were made to do the unpleasant job they had forced the inmates to do. This, after all, was nothing to these men. They, the master race, had been taught to be hard. They could kill in cold blood, and it seemed to the British soldier fit and proper that the killers should bury the nameless, hopeless creatures they'd starved to death.
The SS, when we arrived, were very, very arrogant, very smug, very satisfied. They had no compassion for these people at all. They could see nothing wrong in what they had done. It was very difficult to make them realize the enormity of what they had done. And one way, a very good way, was to make them undo it. And the only way we could do that was to make them personally carry the dead bodies that we hadn't time to bury. Burying these people was done on conveyor belts. Truckloads were being carried to and from the mass graves. But even that was too slow. They brought in a bulldozer, they dug graves, and they pushed the dead into the graves. And one of the lasting impressions in my mind, where these bodies had been dragged, these emaciated people had been dragged across the ground, the system they used was to tie rags round their ankles and pull them by the rags. The result was that the hands dragged out and the fingertips left tracks across the sand. And I have a strong memory of a body that had been dragged out in the position of the crucifix and the finger trails finishing at his fingertips.
But the job of clearing up Belsen was a big one. After 7 dreadful days, the funerals still go on. There seems to be no end. The SS men are not so spick and span now. 7 days of being shouted and cursed at, the handling of corpses by the hundred, are beginning to tell. The burgomeisters and civil officials of the neighborhood were brought to witness the scenes that had been caused as part of the Nazi scheme of things. This was not what they expected. It had been happening for years, but they shrugged their shoulders and beat their brows and tried to say it had been none of their business. But they were mostly silent.
First of all, I wanted them to record that all the local bigwigs and people, the municipal burgomaster and the like, who live within a reasonable range, saw what was being done in burying these tragic figures. Some of the Germans we brought in to be filmed when the bodies were being buried in the pit just couldn't look anymore. I wanted to prove that they had seen it, so there was evidence, because I guess rightly that most people would deny that it happened.
They were given an address by a British officer through a loudspeaker van.
What you will see here is such a disgrace to the German people. And yet it is only a small part of it, which makes it even more difficult to tolerate. You, who did not rise up spontaneously to cleanse the name of Germany. You must expect to atone with toil until you have reared a new generation possessing the instinctive goodwill to prevent a repetition of such horrible cruelties.
Meanwhile, back at the camp, those who were still living were being attended to. Supplies of hot soup were prepared, and those who could eat unaided were fed as quickly as possible. There had been no water supply for 6 days. The Germans pleaded it had been cut. We laid on water in a few hours, and before 12 hours had passed, had sufficient to enable them to wash. Inmates thought there was a snag at first, expected to be beaten for going near it probably. But when they learned that the dream was true, hot water. And these are the people the Nazis said delighted in being dirty. Lack of soap and water had brought lice to the inmates, and lice carry typhus. To get rid of typhus, one must first get rid of lice, so contaminated patients were removed from their huts and put through a laundry process. DDT was dusted over them, and they were washed clean, wrapped in blankets, and removed in clean ambulances by teams working in relays in a miracle of relief work.
You know, they'd seen a thing or two, these soldiers, you know, they'd been through a war. But I don't think anybody could imagine in their worst dreams anything like Belsen. And of course, the natural reaction was to give them food. I don't think any soldier could have eaten a thing. And that was another disaster, because people started eating and died because of eating, because we weren't used to eating. And unless that was very carefully monitored, the body couldn't take it. So thousands of people died after the liberation.
Clothes were another urgent problem, so an outfitting department was set up, and clothes gathered from shops in the surrounding towns were soon being tried on and gossiped over, as women loved to do. There were more than 200 children under 12 years old found still alive in Belsen camp. To those children, clean, dry clothes and kind words from a stranger were strange, undreamed of, mysterious things. Some had been born behind barbed wire. In what circumstances, one dare not try to imagine. Where are their parents? Here, perhaps? Or here? Or down here in this pit? We shall never know who they were or from what homes they were torn, whether they were Catholics, Lutherans, or Jews. We only know they were born, they suffered, and died in agony in Belsen camp. And so they lie, Jews, Lutherans, and Catholics, indistinguishable, cheek to cheek in a common grave. The living have been taken to a cleaner place. The typhus-infected huts are set afire. The barbed wire goes down. The striped livery goes with it. Do not imagine that this was the only black spot uncovered in Germany. There were over 300 others.
We now know that there were more than 5,000 such camps. To show that Belsen was not unique, the film included scenes from different camps of the shocking range of atrocities the Allied troops had found.
Dachau.
No German can say he did not know about them. The whole world had heard of Dachau, for it was publicized by the Nazis as a model camp ever since its inception way back in 1933. Here, as at Belsen, men knew hunger, men became weak, men fell sick until they died where they lay on the floor. In Hut 30 alone, there is recorded, for example, 72 deaths within 24 hours. The prisoners arrived often in railway trucks, but there had been no hurry to unload this one. They went away, leaving the prisoners to die of hunger and cold and typhus. We found them like this, frozen stiff in the snow alongside a public road. By some miracle, 17 men were still alive. All the rest, about 3,000, were dead.
American troops, incensed by what they found, immediately executed 122 SS guards.
Buchenwald.
This was the center of a huge armaments complex. In April 1945, there had been 80,000 slave laborers here. But a few days before liberation, 20,000 Jews were marched away by the Germans.
Here, Schoker, the camp commandant, said, "I want at least 600 Jewish deaths reported in the camp offices every day." People were tattooed across the belly with slave numbers and forced to work on starvation diet. People were coldly and systematically tortured. All this seems so remote from humanity, so far beyond the behavior of man.
Mauthausen.
40,000 people had died here since the beginning of the year. Here, the gas chambers held 200 at a time, and the crematorium dealt with 300 per day, every day.
Thekla.
In the outskirts of Leipzig, an effort was made to prevent 300 forced workers in a factory from being set free by advancing Allied troops. 300 were locked in a mess hut and burned. This is where it stood. Some of the desperate, screaming prisoners broke out. Flamethrowers and submachine guns were waiting to receive them. This was a woman. Some almost reached the barbed wire. Some got there and stayed there, for it was electrified. This was a Polish engineer.
Gardelegen.
American troops advancing did not know that in this barn the Germans had locked 1,800 prisoners and set burning straw alight to suffocate them. In the morning before retreating, they had poured petrol on the bodies in an attempt to burn what remained. It still smoldered when the American troops arrived. This man was shot because he gasped for air trying to escape while the rest of him burned in the barn.
Sidney Bernstein started collecting thousands of feet of film, shot by British, American, and Russian army cameramen. He set out in a 9-page memorandum his intentions for the film. It was to be
factual and documented to the nth degree. It should be in the form of a prosecuting counsel stating his case. It is of extreme importance that German audiences see the faces of the individuals directly responsible. Effort should be made to secure the names and personal background of all persons thus shown, attempting to establish that they were once ordinary people.
Ich heiße Dr. Fritz Klein.
My name is Dr. Fritz Klein. I've been a concentration camp doctor for 1.5 years. I was born on November 24th, 88, so I'm 58 years old. I'm a German from Romania, and I'm speaking today, the 24th of April, 1945.
I won't say every inhabitant of Germany knew, but not of Germans that I came across knew. There was one Tommy there, and I said to him, as the more bodies were being pushed into the pit and these people were standing in front of the pit or behind the pit, do you think they knew about it? He said, of course they did, Gov. What makes you be so certain? Well, he said, when we used to say to them, why don't you get rid of this fellow Hitler? They said, if we did try to do that, we'd be in a concentration camp. So they knew there was a concentration camp.
Sidney Bernstein wanted to underline the role of those German manufacturers whose products had contributed to the death of these victims.
I wanted the names of all the suppliers of the incinerators, different machinery that was used to deal with these poor inmates. And I had the names filmed, top of the incinerators, the sides of a crate and things like that.
The firm that built this wasn't ashamed to sign its work.
The problem that Bernstein then faced was to shape the material into a coherent film. He invited journalists Colin Wills and Richard Crossman to write the commentary and treatment. Then a famous Hollywood director joined them.
Alfred Hitchcock was an eminent director, and I thought he, a brilliant man, would have some ideas how we could tie it all together. And he had.
Film editors Stuart McAllister and Peter Tanner worked on the film for 5 months. Peter Tanner remembers that Hitchcock was afraid the Germans would claim the documentary was faked.
Hitchcock's main contribution to the film was to try to make it as authentic as possible. It was most important that everybody, particularly the Germans themselves, should believe that this was true and that really this horror had happened and people had suffered to that extent. And I can remember him strolling up and down in his suite and carriages and saying, how can we make that convincing? We tried to make shots as long as possible, use panning shots so that there was no possibility of trickery. And going from respected dignitaries or high churchmen straight to the bodies and corpses that couldn't be suggested that we were faking the film. One of the suggestions was a montage of possessions of the people who had died or been sent to the gas chamber, and they were pathetic things, wedding rings, and children's toys, and handbags, brooches, and all that sort of thing.
Here were found 820,000 pairs of boots and shoes. Prisoners paid their own fare to Majdanek. They thought they were going to new homes, and so they brought their most precious portable possessions. Nothing material could be wasted. These packages contain human hair, carefully sorted and weighed. Nothing was wasted. Even the teeth were taken out of their mouths. byproducts of the system. Toothbrushes, nail brushes, shoe brushes, shaving brushes. If 1 man in 10 wears spectacles, how many does this heap represent? All these things belong to men and women and children like ourselves, quite ordinary people from all parts of the world.
Hitchcock's other main contribution was to insist on the use of shots of charming German countryside as a contrast to the horrors of the camps.
His idea was show the area surrounding each camp and show how people had led a normal life outside, whether it was boy meets girl or whether they were harvesting, whether they were on the lakes, completely ignoring what was happening within a range of anything from 1 to 5 miles.
Ebensee is a holiday resort in the mountains. The air is clean and pure. It cures sickness. And there is a sweetness about the place, a gentle peace. In this place, the Luftwaffe or SS Panzer officer on leave relaxes, eats well, breathes deeply, finds romance. Everything is charming and picturesque. Prisoners at Dachau and Buchenwald dreaded being sent here. To them, this place did not mean recuperation, only starvation, tuberculosis through slavery in an underground factory, and finally left to cough one's life out unaided and crowded in the filth and stench of a hut unfit for dogs, but for some reason called a hospital. Able to see the mountains, but what use are mountains without food? The daily collection of bodies was disposed of through this chimney.
We wanted to know whether the Germans surrounding a concentration camp knew about it. So Hitch did this drawing circles, 1 mile from the camp, 2 miles from the camp, 10 miles from the camp, 20 miles from the camp, what population in each of these areas in the ring, and then did they know about it, and so on, which would have been part of the film, showing it to them at the end and say, well, now, you live there.
German citizens are brought in from Weimar. They had to see too, to see what they had been fighting for and we had been fighting against. They came cheerfully like sightseers to a chamber of horrors, for here indeed were some real horrors. If a prisoner had a curiously tattooed skin, it was taken from him. We can only hope he was dead when it was done. The skin was tanned and made into lampshades, etc. These shrunken heads belonged to 2 Polish prisoners who had escaped and been recaptured. Some of the visitors did not care for the sight and were assisted by ex-prisoners. They had been aware of the camp and willing to make use of the cheap labor it provided, so long as they were beyond smelling range of it.
Sidney Bernstein's film could only show the camps after they were liberated. They were mainly concentration camps where thousands of people of all faiths were worked to death. But there had been very different places, not concentration but extermination camps. Millions had been systematically murdered in what the Nazis called the final solution. As the German army moved eastwards, Jews had been rounded up, driven out of their towns and villages, and at first publicly slaughtered. Often the victims, like these near Riga, were made to dig their own graves. But these massacres were so public that German witnesses complained to Berlin. So from December 1941, 5 secret extermination camps were set up in remote areas of Poland and occupied Russia. Treblinka, Chelmno, Sobibor, Belzec and Maletrostinets near the Russian city of Minsk. Their sole purpose was the swift and systematic murder of people like these, men, women and children deported from all over occupied Europe. More than 2 million people were gassed in these 5 death camps alone. But their work had been completed by 1943. When the Red Army arrived, there was nothing left to film. But the Russians did liberate this camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau, a huge extermination system, but also a slave labor camp. Here, a percentage were saved to be slaves for the Nazi war effort for as long as they could survive. In this part of the program, we concentrate on those who are still alive. They tell us what happened before the cameras got there. Leon Greenman had British and Dutch nationality. In early 1943, he was deported from Rotterdam to Auschwitz with his wife and 3-year-old son, Barney. At the time, they had no idea where they were going.
They told us already months beforehand, and where we could hear about that, we had to go to Poland to work. We always set to work, they said. We never thought nothing else but to work. And we would see our wives at the weekends. So we accepted that. We didn't know better. If we would have known different, then something else would have happened.
Hugo Grin, then aged 13, was deported to Auschwitz from Hungary as late as 1944. Even then, the name Auschwitz still meant nothing to his family.
I found on one of the wagons a slip of paper which had on it the route of this train, and that it was going to go via Slovakia, eventually arriving at a place called Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I actually showed this to members of my family, my father and the friends, said, look, this is where we're going. And people looked at it and they said, well, fine. That which today is such a byword, at that time had no ominous significance for us at all. So actually the name didn't mean anything.
Long train journeys, often in cattle trucks with no food or water, brought the deportees to their unknown destination.
And we sat in that journey for 36 hours. And during that time, we didn't get a lot of sleep. We dozed off occasionally, and then we talked again. And I said to my wife, if I happen to be ill and not come back from there, don't forget, if you remarry, get a husband that'll be good for the child. She said, of course. She said, and if I don't come back, you get a wife that's good for the child.
Journey's End, Auschwitz railway station, the first selections began.
There was this man walking up and down the platform. He was clearly part of a detail that was going to clear the wagons. And he was muttering in Yiddish. Du bist 18 Jahre alt und du hast ein Fach. You are 18 years old and you've got a trade. I kept muttering it, repeating it over and over and over. And my father, who was at that point with me, he understood what this man was trying to do. I did not. So that by the time we came to the head of this line, where the actual selection took place, and I was asked how old I was, and I said I was 19, and I was 13. And that, yes, I had a trade, and I was a carpenter and a joiner. And in that way, I was motioned to go with those people who were destined to live. Whereas my brother, who at that point was 11 and quite small, just couldn't say it, or rather he tried to say it and wasn't believed. So he went to the other side.
We were separated, men from the women. And we stood there, wondering. Then one of the women, where my wife and child were standing, ran away from the women towards her husband. And halfway she was met by an SS officer, a man about 40, 50 years of age. And he had a stick in his hand, he let it come down on her head, and she fell down on the platform. And he kicked her in the stomach, in the belly. And I saw all this, and I was thinking to myself, now what's happening? Then he turned around straight away to us, to the boys, the fellas, and by putting his hand on the shoulder and the stick on the shoulder, he counted all 50 men of the whole lot. He sorted out 4 or 5 nice-looking young women, and I guess the rest, they were told, you go into the bathroom to have a bath. Those that cannot walk, get onto the trucks. I was one of the 50 boys. We had turned to the left, and we marched away to another barrack. While we were marching, we stopped a little way, and a truck come along, loaded with women and children. And on top of the truck, I saw my wife in the middle, standing straight up, the child in her arms. She had a pointed cape cover on. She had made it in Hollander, and that's the last I saw of her. I can say now that from the 800 people, there were 800 people that left Western Warwick that morning. Only 50 were taken out, and those few young women. The rest went into the gas chambers. So I can say that my wife was guest and child. All the others were guests within 2 hours, if not sooner.
To ensure that the doomed prisoners cooperated, elaborate deception was maintained to the end. An official SS report described what should happen when these people reached the gas chambers.
The prisoners are told that they are to be cleansed and disinfected. They must therefore completely undress to be bathed. To avoid panic, they're instructed to arrange their clothing neatly so they can find their things again after their bath. Everything proceeds in a perfectly orderly fashion. They enter a large cellar room that resembles a shower bath. The doors are shut, and containers drop down into the pillars. As soon as the containers touch the base of the pillars, they release substances that put people to sleep in 1 minute. A few minutes later, the door opens on the other side, and the corpses are loaded into elevators and brought up to the first floor, where 10 large crematoria are located.
It didn't always happen in such an orderly fashion, but the end result was the same. Millions of bodies burned in furnaces like these. Using material shot by the Russians, Bernstein's film tried to grapple with the scale of what had happened at Auschwitz.
Here, 4 million people were murdered. As many men, women and children as you could pack into a great city. This camp was scientifically planned with a view to mass murder. Vast extensions were still being built. Arrangements of gas chambers, mortuaries, and incinerators. The normal extermination rate was 10,000 to 12,000 a day. 5 crematoria with a capacity of 279,000 per month. Germans had watched them die. They had wanted to watch them die, for they constructed special peepholes in the doorways of the gas chambers where they could observe the effects of the poison gas Zyklon. Here are some of the containers, the mask worn by the operator, and the poisons used for the injections. These children are twins. When identical twins were born to non-German parents, they were confiscated and handed over to an experimental station. German doctors injected them with diseases and attempted cures. Success in the cure was not important, as these children were written off, unknown. They had no names, only numbers tattooed on their arms.
Those adults who were picked out to live were quickly processed. Clothes were taken away, head shaved, and then they were numbered.
After being 2 days there, we got our number tattooed on our arm. You see, look. And that was already, to us, very immoral, you know. We felt like gangsters.
I mean, all you have to do is to shave a man's head, and immediately he's a nobody. He ceases to exist. And you isolate people from their families. Say somebody is taken with his family, then at one point they're separated, so you are alone. You get your head shaven, you get a number, you forget who you are, you're just nobody. The next thing is you get insulted, you get no food or just subsistence level, so you're hungry, you're cold, you're made to stand up for hours on end to be counted. You probably have dysentery, you're not allowed to go and relieve yourself, and the end result is that you are an animal, or worse than an animal. And to see this happen to people who started off as perfectly normal human beings, and it's a process that works very fast. I mean, you could do this to anybody around here in no time. You can deprive people of their human dignity and get animals. And then it's very easy to destroy these animals. Nothing to do with human beings anymore.
If you were made of weakness, you went weak and you went into the gas chambers. The selections were once a month or so. The barracks were all locked, nobody was allowed out, and there were a couple of doctors then, and they sat down and you had to march or walk past by. And if your bibs was skinny, and your arms and so, you went sorted out for the gas chambers. Those who still had a bit of muscle on them, they were still allowed to live, to go on.
But there were sometimes guards who so clearly enjoyed what they were doing and so wholeheartedly threw themselves into it that they became, I suppose, an unbearable menace. And the particular individual, he wasn't even a German, he was a Ukrainian, a young Ukrainian kid wearing an SS uniform, whose hobby, it seemed, was to, whenever there was any crowd of prisoners around, would simply take his rifle, swing it above his head, and then bring it down on someone, whoever, for whatever reason. I mean, no, for no reason. And so really, all of us was in this, I suppose, unbearable jeopardy. And then one day an opportunity presented itself where we thought we could actually kill him and then not breathe easier, but breathe slightly easier. And so it was done.
There were 667 known escapes from Auschwitz. But after any resistance came swift reprisals, including public hangings.
There were 12 Poles. It happened to be that one or two of the Poles had done something to an SS officer during the day. And for punishment, they took 12 to be counted for. And I saw the man stand on the little bucket, a little bunk, a little wooden box or something. And the capo of the camp, he put the nooses around the necks. And then he kicked away the little box and he hung. The second one saw what was happening. Then it was his turn. The third one saw what was happening, and so on. Some of them didn't die quickly. The tongues came out of the mouth. The knot wasn't placed properly. The body turned and wriggled. I'll never forget that. 12. And when they were all there, they were cut down, loaded on a barrow, and wheeled away. And then they said, now everybody into the barracks. And we went into the barracks and we queued up for our soup. We had to forget it.
What sort of things were done?
Anything from having to stand for hours, the whole camp, on appels, on sort of being counted, recounted, or simply just standing there, to what the Germans called being zentled. That was a particularly fearful experience when literally people were counted off 1, 2, 3, 4 to 10, and the 10th one step out, whichever the 10th was, and they would be executed. And I'd gone through 2 such zentlings in different places, and then you begin to realize also how chancy it was that you were 9 or 8 and not 10. That's massive punishment, and it's a very powerful deterrent.
the Nazis succeeded in concealing the full reality of Auschwitz-Birkenau from Western governments until 1944. Information that reached Jewish agencies and governments in exile about extermination camps was often treated with great skepticism, as we can see in British and American government files. Historian Martin Gilbert has made a special study of these official documents.
There's no doubt that sometimes, reading it now, it is shocking for the modern reader to see how individual officials dismissed as rumors, as exaggeration, as Jewish sob stuff, the stories which reached them. But I believe these were a small group of officials, that somehow they didn't represent the mass, that their mental horizons were limited because they were writing in Whitehall and the slaughters were taking place in countries they'd never seen to people they'd never met, and on a scale which was actually incomprehensible even to the Jews themselves.
In spring 1944, 5 prisoners escaped from Auschwitz and brought out to the West the news of millions of deaths. An international outcry stopped the deportation of hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews midstream. As the Allies were bombing industrial targets only 5 miles from Auschwitz, Jewish agencies pressed them to bomb the camp, but they didn't. And in the summer, deportations started again.
We find some fairly hostile comments and a general reluctance by some officials to pursue it, on the grounds, as one of them put it, that it would lead to the loss of valuable British lives of pilots to no purpose. On the other hand, there were other officials who wouldn't accept this view and who urged that it should at least be looked into. Unfortunately, in the States, in the United States, the man responsible for dealing with it gave the instruction on the first request, kill it. And on the 5 subsequent times that he was asked by different Jewish bodies to look into the bombing of Auschwitz, he repeated his pro forma answer that this could not be done.
I always hoped if I get killed by a bomb here, it'll be a blessing to me. It will end the misery. But never such a thing happened. And the bombing that was done was nothing, really. I didn't see any buildings coming down. I didn't see any railways being bombed. So I can't see what was done, no. There was no damage done like bombing in Rotterdam or the bombing in London. So that was very little, and it was a disappointment to me.
There was one occasion, I think that was one of the most painful moments for me, when we were allowed in one of the camps in Silesia called Liberose to send postcards. It was Sunday afternoon. Everybody was given a postcard and access to a pencil, which was very rare. And you could write anywhere in the world. And at first I was really, terrific. I'll write to somebody. And then I realized there was no one I could write to.
As the Russians got closer and closer, the Nazis tried frantically to conceal the evidence of mass murder. The gas chambers and crematoria of Auschwitz were blown up, and thousands died on forced marches as the remaining slave laborers were sent away from the east, back into the heart of Germany.
And we marched out. We walked from Auschwitz to Gleiwitz. A lot of incidents happened then. If you couldn't march along anymore, you were shot. I saw them run away from the march, saw the SS kneel down, his gun on the shoulder, and there was another one dead.
What was the reaction of the German people along the way who saw you marching past?
I can only say what I observed, because I actually don't know what they may have felt. But I was a very young boy, and I know that we looked awful, ragged, probably muddy many times. I'm sure we actually looked hungry. And it still continues to puzzle and to trouble me that I can recall not a single instance when we're marching through villages and towns and suburbs, and in the midst of civilian people who were busy going to and from work and leading ordinary lives, that no one ever said hello or good luck or whatever. And no one ever threw an apple or an onion or a potato or a piece of bread at us. We were, consciously or otherwise, ignored. And we actually marched through, if there is such a thing as physical indifference. It struck me that that's what we were doing. We were walking through indifference.
By late 1944, the remnants of Auschwitz arrived at other camps, dumping grounds for thousands of prisoners. Leon Greenman went to Buchenwald.
Everybody felt that the Americans were near. Liberation was near. And I see still the SS shooting their revolvers through the windows into the barracks, and the people rushing out of the wooden staircases at the sides of the wooden barracks in Buchenwald. And the first 5 or 6, they fell, and hundreds trampled on them. And when they all walked away, they were laying bodies. They were dead.
In December 1944, Anita Lasker was sent by train from Auschwitz hundreds of miles to Belsen.
We had no idea really where we were going, but we were told there were rumors that we were going to Belsen, and it's a very nice place. It's a place where people recuperate. Couldn't quite believe it, however, and we were also told that if we work hard and build the camp up, all will be very well. However, we got there, we were vintage prisoners, you know, we could smell, we could see how things are going.
The influx into these camps was now so enormous that at the end conditions were worse than ever. Then came liberation.
2 days later, about a dozen American soldiers came in. Must have been doctors and photographers and picture people. And they came into my barrack, and my capo said to me, the German capo, he said, you speak English, you talk to the people. So I talked to them. I introduced myself and I said, hello, glad to see you. And it smelled to death and it smelled to dirt in the camps. And for an outsider, was something not nice. So he said, well, we've seen it all. I said, you've seen nothing. I said, please come along with me. And I took them from bed to bed, pulled the blankets away, and I said, look, skeletons, bones and skins. That's what they've done to us. And big, strong soldiers, they turned away. They were disgusted with it.
When these camps were liberated, the world was shocked by the sight of these people. But they had survived. They were still living. They could be filmed. Their families couldn't.
I think to me, probably the most painful thing is the one thing that I didn't actually see, but I know happened. For instance, what happened to my parents. They were taken away one fine day. And the next thing I knew was a postcard from my father from a place called Ispica that nobody's even ever heard about, where he just wrote the beginning of a psalm. I lift up my eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help. I found out that these particular people dug their own graves and were shot into them. So in a way, to me, although I didn't see it happen, is the most painful thing that you live with. You know?
The first newsreels of concentration camps caused considerable impact. In occupied Germany, civilians were forced to watch them, as were German prisoners of war in Britain. At the end of April 1945, Churchill's Minister of Information, Brendan Bracken, referred to Sidney Bernstein's documentary in the House of Commons.
The material is being used by the Ministry of Information for making a film to be shown in Germany, and a version of this will be available for showing to audiences in this country.
Conceived in wartime, the documentary was aimed at the German people, and its message was summed up in the final sequence.
It remains for us to care for these the living. It remains for us to hope that Germans may help to mend what they have broken and cleanse what they have befouled. This was the end of the journey they had so confidently begun in 1933. 12 years? No. In terms of barbarity and brutality, they had traveled backwards for 12,000 years.
The film neared completion, but for the government, peace was to bring new problems. On August the 4th, 1945, Sidney Bernstein received a memo from the Foreign Office.
My personal opinion is that we need a first-class documentary record of these atrocities, and that we cannot be content with the rather crude and unthought-out newsreel so far shown. On the other hand, policy at the moment in Germany is entirely in the direction of encouraging, stimulating and interesting the Germans out of their apathy, and there are people around the CNC who will say, no atrocity film.
What do you think lay behind this note?
Nothing behind it in the sense of some deep mysterious thing or somebody sabotaging the national effort. But it was that they had got the responsibility of getting that country on its feet again. Because once you've demolished it, that's not the end of war, that's only the beginning of the battle for peace, which means you rebuild it. And they had to have people to do that, and the only people they had to do it were Germans.
Germany was now in a critical condition. Buildings were in ruins. People were starving. 20 million were homeless. 10 million refugees were on the move. In August 1945, 4,000 Berliners were dying each day. The British military government was much more concerned with these crises than with showing an atrocity film. Lord Annan, then Lieutenant Colonel Noel Annan, was a member of the British Control Commission stationed in Berlin.
I mean, there's a great deal of competition between military government officers about clearing up the wreckage, getting the sewage working, getting the refugees into camps, or getting them marching one way, and usually, if you can, out of your own Christ and into somebody else's. There was all that. The general desire for efficient and just government. Now, that was one thing. The second thing, I think, that the colonial mentality showed itself in the British was, well, if we got to get these people working and working with us, the sooner then that we, as it were, can get them on our side and make them realize that we are really going to be their leaders, the better. And therefore, don't let's have too much trouble. The British military government, of course, was concerned with getting the place going, whereas I, in the political division, was concerned with denazification and going round to military government officers and saying, I'm sorry, your mayor has got to go. He was a Nazi in 1933, but this man's the best chap I've got in the place. I can't do without him, came back the reply. And I said, I'm sorry, the directives say he's got to go and he's out. I wasn't absolutely the most popular man in the British zone for going around and saying that.
The first Nazi war crimes trial opened in the British sector in September 1945. Belsen Commandant Joseph Kramer and Dr. Fritz Klein were among 11 sentenced to death. But although individual Nazis were put on trial, the British government's main concern was not with retribution, but with the effect of a severe winter on the German people. This had been predicted in the Foreign Office memo to Sidney Bernstein in August.
I would say that the atrocity film, if really good and well documented, would be shown willingly and successfully in 9 months' time, when the difficulties of the winter have been tackled. There may, therefore, be no hurry for it.
That winter proved a long one. Germany eventually emerged from this sort of chaos, but it was divided between the West and Russia, and soon there were other reasons why the film would not be shown in the western part.
It became a nation with whom we were, in the end, going to have relations with. And so, therefore, that's what happens. The whole idea that the collective guilt of the whole German people should be brought home to them by 48, 49 was, of course, out of the question in the terms that had been thought of in April 45.
Do you think it should have been shown at the time?
At the time, 2 Germans.
So you disagreed with the memo? they sent you?
I didn't take kindly to it.
A lot of things happen which are not spoken about. Nothing was nice, nothing was good. You were not in the camps to live. You were there to die, to work and die, the utmost 3 or 4 months. Nobody who did this expected any of us to come back.
Some people are still saying that these concentration camps never happened. Do you believe that this film will prove that it did?
I do, but if it doesn't, it's failed miserably. Very sad. But if you could get all the people who say these things in one room and show it to them, it might be effective.
This is a terrible thing. That's why it is so important to show it again and again. One doesn't have to keep rubbing it in, but from time to time, I think a reminder has to be made that it has happened. And there are enough people alive still who've actually seen it.